The war on terror is every would-be authoritarian's dream, the perfect excuse to democratically strip citizens of their rights under the guise of protection, and would be the tool by which the Obama regime would identify and eliminate any opposition. Drones, trapwire, and the NSA would serve as the government's ever-present eye, while a secret police force is established to arrest and detain American citizens without trial at sites like Guantanamo Bay, not for connections to terrorism, but for reading the wrong text or speaking the wrong words. America would become the futuristic equivalent to the USSR. Gulags, surveillance, and all. However, suppose that not one, but two wars have and still are being fought on American soil, one more so than the other, but having flown largely under the radar of Americans who subscribe to either of the two largest national parties. So much so that the very names of these wars barely even register to Americans as a home front war. This is the view of the Libertarian Party, the nation's third largest party and the often ignored alternative to progressivism and conservatism, and the two wars referred to are the war on drugs and the war on terror, both of which have been responsible for the militarization of the American police force, the suspension of rights and freedoms, the skyrocketing of the prison population, and of crime rates in cities. Ethnostates, states populated by and operated in the interests of a particular ethnic group. The word itself, ethnostate, may seem fairly new, however the concept itself isn't. Throughout history, it has tended to be something of a norm, and only in recent decades has the concept become synonymous with bigotry and hatred. However, such a statement fails to acknowledge the simple truth that the majority of humans prefer those who share their values, ideals, and culture. Fascist. Is Trump one? No, and if he was, you could bet things would look much different than they do now. To his father writing positively on socialism, to his parents meeting in a Russian language class, when at the time Russian was really only spoken in the USSR, and Obama himself being mentored by a member of Communist Party USA, to name a few. Sternly anti-Trump, seem to have a following of at least 18,000 on Twitter alone, and would no doubt attempt some kind of organized mass revolt. But their very organization works against them. All these members, the majority of which are in their 20s and teens, do hold public meetings but primarily communicate digitally. Thus the organization of 18,000 suddenly becomes less organized, but beyond that there lies another issue. They've all given themselves away. Everyone who has followed, liked, or shared their material has left a digital trail the government could have no trouble tracing, soon zeroing in on the major leadership and wiping them out. Think this is far-fetched? Think Antifa members have covered their tracks well enough? This is Antifa member Eric Clanton. He had struck a man with bike lock while hiding his face and escape, however despite concealing his identity was easily identified by some guys on 4chan who discovered him through cross-referencing photos and locating his social media. If 4chan can do this, imagine what the US government could accomplish. Suffice to say, any resistance movements would pose little threat to the new regime and would only grow to become hated by the peaceful Americans who would suffer on account of their actions. One could argue that values are not exclusive to any one ethnic group, yes, but speaking scientifically, are we not a product of nature and nurture? If nature is chalked up to our genes, would two people of the same race not share more genetics than two people of different races? So there is reason to believe that there's more commonality here. But what about nurture? This is where another argument for ethnostates comes into the question. You look at Japan and you find centuries of Japanese culture. You look to Europe and you find centuries of European culture. You look to the Middle East and see centuries of Middle Eastern culture. And it is the people of those regions and those regions alone who created those cultures and civilizations. You could not create a Japanese culture out of European stock, nor could you have created a European culture out of African stock, as these people by nature and eons of evolution have had to develop different ways of thinking and building and coexisting in order to survive in their respective environments. Assuming Trump's campaign promises were things he himself hoped to achieve and not just buzzwords, he now has the capability and resources to fully push them forward. Most notably the southern border wall, and the complete shutdown of all Muslims entering the US. We'll get back to that in a moment. We would also see a boom for industry as Trump restores thousands of manufacturing jobs and imposes enormous tariffs on imports from China and Mexico, leaving Americans to purchase American products, giving the economy a steady climb. We'd also see a follow-through of Trump's promise to bomb ISIS oil fields and improve relations with Russia, which would lead to improved relations with Syria, all three of which would make a collaborative effort to eradicate Islamic fundamentalism and stabilize the Middle East, unleashing an unrelenting campaign of destruction upon terrorist encampments and territories held by ISIS. Internationally, one could argue that relations would be strained. However, looking at international reactions to Trump's victory in our timeline, it's clear most nations would be either fearful of him or prepared to get on his good side. To put it simply, no nation would dare mess with the US. Which brings us to Mexico, and Trump's promise to make them pay for the border wall. Something they had refused to do in our timeline, but now having demonstrated clear aggressive capabilities in the Middle East, and the sheer imposing nature Trump would present, Mexico would be forced to pay for the wall or potentially see military intervention, occupation as a means to create a militarized deterrent for illegal immigration. something which could escalate into a second Mexican-American War, but would be even more one-sided this time over. In short, a fascist America under Trump is a far different scenario than the one we currently have. He's an elected official with some nationalistic views, which certainly doesn't qualify him to be a fascist. Conditions would become increasingly unfavorable for native whites as media rhetoric is built up against them and prejudice grows within the poor communities, who would grow increasingly resentful of their slightly better standard of living. These immigrants would quickly outbreed the native population, raising their numbers and earning them more voting power in the Democratic West. And given that many would be either poor or working low-skilled, unglamorous jobs, they are likely to vote for greater government regulation, higher taxation, and become highly reliant on federal handouts. Businesses would become very hesitant to hire unskilled laborers, but as worker shortages rise and diversity quotas are enforced, so would they be forced to employ a substandard workforce. This would lead the economies of the West to either plateau or decline as skilled labor is de-incentivized, and contribution to the nation in general becomes unnecessary for the survival of the citizen, leading to an overall decline of the nation itself. These are not just wars, these are wars waged by the government against its own citizens, and the process has been so gradual that we now accept what is, as some claim, a military state, as the way things have always been. Government and people seem to have lost faith in each other, both sides fear the stockpiling of weapons by the other side, and there are whispers of both sides preparing for military action. The Second American Civil War would also be akin to a Second American Revolution, in which the people are forced to exert their right to abolish a government that acts against their common interests.